The morning of July 10th, 1940. Flight Lieutenant George Burges pushed the throttle forward on his Hawker Hurricane, climbing hard through crystalline Mediterranean sky above the limestone cliffs of Malta. Below him, Grand Harbour lay exposed and vulnerable. Above him, 20 Savoia Marchetti SM.79 bombers approached in tight formation, their distinctive hunchbacked fuselages gleaming in the summer sun. The Italians had grown confident. For nearly a month, since Mussolini declared war on June 10th, their bombers had struck Malta with near impunity. 4 aging Gloster Gladiator biplanes, soon to be immortalized as Faith, Hope and Charity, had put up brave resistance, but could barely scratch the Italian formations. The SM.79 pilots had been told their aircraft was too fast, too modern for the British to stop. They believed it. George Burges had different information. Mounted in the wings of his Hurricane were 8 Browning .303 caliber machine guns. Each gun could fire 1,150 rounds per minute. Together, they could deliver 320 rounds in a 2-second burst. The Italians were about to discover what concentrated firepower meant. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This would become the first engagement that shattered Italian assumptions about air superiority over Malta. It would not involve 23 bombers destroyed in a single mission. The historical reality was more complex, more grinding, more revealing about the fundamental mismatch between Italian doctrine and British defensive capability. Over the following 2 months, through dozens of raids and hundreds of sorties, the Hurricane would systematically demolish Italian confidence until daylight bombing became a death sentence. The story begins not with a single catastrophic defeat, but with a series of engagements that exposed every weakness in Italian bomber design, every gap in their tactical thinking, and every consequence of prioritizing speed over protection. The SM.79 Sparviero, the Sparrow Hawk, would prove to be a magnificent aircraft in the wrong war, flown by skilled pilots against an enemy they fatally underestimated. To understand why Italian bombers failed so completely over Malta, one must first understand what the Savoia Marchetti SM.79 actually was. In June 1940, it represented one of Italy's finest aviation achievements. Developed from an 8-seat commercial transport in 1934, the SM.79 had set multiple world records for speed and endurance. Its distinctive dorsal hump housed a gunner position and gave the aircraft its nickname Il Gobbo Maledetto, the damned hunchback. The specifications were impressive by any standard. 3 Alfa Romeo 126 RC-34 radial engines, each producing 780 horsepower, gave the SM.79i a maximum speed of 430 km per hour, roughly 267 miles per hour. Its operational range exceeded 1,180 miles. The bomb bay could carry 1,250 kilograms of ordnance, or alternatively, a single aerial torpedo. A crew of 5 operated the bomber: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, radio operator, and gunners. Defensive armament consisted of 3 12.7mm Breda Safat machine guns and 2 7.7mm weapons, positioned at various points around the fuselage. The forward-firing fixed machine gun was mounted above the cockpit. A dorsal turret covered the upper arc. The ventral gondola beneath the fuselage provided a firing position for the lower hemisphere. In theory, this arrangement offered 360-degree defensive coverage. The SM.79 had proven itself in Spain during the Civil War, operating often without fighter escort and relying on speed to evade Republican fighters. Italian propaganda touted the Sparviero as virtually unstoppable, a modern bomber that could penetrate enemy airspace, deliver its payload, and return home before slower interceptors could engage. By June 1940, nearly 600 SM.79 seconds equipped Regia Aeronautica bomber units across every theatre where Italy fought. This confidence rested on several assumptions. First, that the bomber's speed advantage over existing British fighters in the Mediterranean would permit evasion of interception. Second, that the defensive armament would deter or damage attacking fighters. Third, that British forces on Malta lacked sufficient modern aircraft to mount effective resistance. Every assumption would be proven catastrophically wrong. Malta's strategic importance demanded its neutralization. The island fortress sat astride Axis supply routes to North Africa, where Italian forces were preparing operations against British Egypt. From Malta's airfields and harbours, British submarines, bombers, and torpedo aircraft could savage Italian convoys attempting to supply Libya. Submarines based at Malta sank 25 Axis supply ships in the first 4 months of 1941 alone. The island represented an unsinkable aircraft carrier positioned exactly where it could inflict maximum damage on Italian logistics. When Italy declared war on June 10, 1940, Malta's air defence consisted of exactly 4 flyable Sea Gladiator biplane fighters, 42 anti-aircraft guns, and 1 obsolescent radar station. The Gladiators were museum pieces, fabric-covered biplanes with open cockpits and fixed landing gear, utterly obsolete against modern monoplanes. They had a maximum speed of 245 miles per hour and were armed with 4.303 machine guns. Against the faster SM.79 seconds flying at 20,000 feet, the Gladiators could barely intercept, much less effectively engage. The first Italian raid struck at dawn on June 11th. 55 SM.79 bombers, escorted by 18 Machi C, 200 Saetta fighters approached Malta's 3 airfields, Halfa, Lucca, and Tarkali. The raid caught the island almost entirely unprepared. The few Gladiators that managed to scramble could not reach the bomber formations before they released their weapons. 142 bombs fell across the 3 airfields. Damage was substantial. The Italians departed unmolested. For the next 2 weeks, Italian raids continued with similar impunity. The Gladiators, brave as their pilots were, simply lacked the performance to pose a serious threat. The SM.79 seconds operated at altitudes and speeds that put them nearly beyond interception. The few engagements that occurred saw the Gladiators struggling to catch bombers that could simply accelerate away from danger. One Gladiator was damaged so severely it had to be written off, reducing Malta's fighter force to 3 aircraft, hence the famous nicknames Faith, Hope, and Charity. But British planners understood that Malta could not survive with obsolete biplanes. If the island fell, the central Mediterranean would become an Axis lake. Supplies to North Africa would flow unimpeded. The entire British position in Egypt and the Middle East would be threatened. Malta had to hold, which meant Malta needed modern fighters. On June 21st, 2 Hurricanes landed at Lucca while transiting from North Africa to Egypt. They were immediately pressed into Malta's defence. On June 22nd, 6 more arrived, 3 of which remained. These aircraft represented the first modern monoplanes based on Malta. The Hurricane Mark I featured a Rolls-Royce Merlin 3 engine producing 1,030 horsepower. Maximum speed reached 318 miles per hour, over 70 miles per hour faster than the Gladiator. Service ceiling extended to 36,000 feet, well above the SM.79's operational altitude. Most importantly, the Hurricane carried 8 Browning .303-inch machine guns mounted in the wings. This armament deserves particular emphasis, for it would prove decisive. Each Browning fired at 1,150 rounds per minute, though the rate of fire varied slightly between individual weapons. The 8 guns were arranged in 2 groups of 4, positioned in bays incorporated into the outer wing panels. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, they delivered a combined rate of over 9,000 rounds per minute, or 160 rounds per second. The ammunition load varied by model, but the Hurricane Mark I typically carried 334 rounds per gun, providing roughly 17 seconds of continuous fire. Pilots were trained to fire in short bursts, 2-second bursts being the standard to conserve ammunition and prevent overheating. A 2-second burst unleashed 320 rounds at the target. The killing power came not from the individual bullets, but from their concentration. At typical combat range of 250 yards, The 8-gun pattern created a cone of fire roughly 6 feet in diameter. Every bullet passing through that cone struck the target area. Against bombers built with fabric covering, thin aluminum skin, and unprotected fuel tanks, the effect was devastating. The .303 British round fired from the Browning had a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,440 feet per second. While not as powerful as larger caliber weapons, the sheer volume of fire compensated. More importantly, the British used mixed ammunition belts containing armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. The incendiary rounds were particularly effective against aircraft with unprotected fuel systems. Italian pilots who had operated successfully in Spain were about to encounter a level of defensive firepower they had never imagined. The Hurricanes represented a quantum leap in fighter capability, faster, better armed, more maneuverable at combat altitudes, and flown by RAF pilots who were, on average, better trained than their Italian opponents. The first Hurricane victory over Malta came on June 22nd, when a Gladiator piloted by Flight Lieutenant Burges intercepted an SM.79 on reconnaissance. But it was the arrival of more Hurricanes in early August that would fundamentally alter the tactical situation. Operation Hurry, launched on July 31st, 1940, was designed to fly 12 Hurricane Mark I fighters from HMS Argus to Malta, guided by 2 Blackburn Skua dive bombers. This was the first of what would become known as the Club Run's desperate operations to ferry fighters to Malta across the Mediterranean through hostile airspace, from carriers operating at extreme range. The operation succeeded in delivering sufficient Hurricanes to form 261 Squadron at Malta. The Italians immediately noticed the difference. SM.79 formations that had grown accustomed to unopposed bombing runs now faced aggressive interception by faster, heavily armed modern fighters. The first major engagement after the Hurricane reinforcement occurred on August 2nd. Italian bombers approaching Malta were met by the new fighters climbing rapidly to intercept altitude. What followed shocked Italian bomber crews. The Hurricanes attacked from altitude, diving on the SM.79 formations with tremendous speed advantage. Italian gunners opened fire, but hitting a fighter diving at over 300 miles per hour proved extraordinarily difficult. The Hurricanes closed to point-blank range, often within 200 yards, before opening fire. When 8 Brownings fired simultaneously, the effect on an SM.79 was catastrophic. The SM.79's construction made it particularly vulnerable. The fuselage was built around a welded tubular steel frame, covered with duralumin forward, duralumin and plywood over the top, and fabric elsewhere. The wings were wooden construction. More critically, the fuel tanks had no armor protection, no self-sealing capability, no fire suppression systems beyond basic extinguishers. The tanks were simple aluminum cells holding aviation fuel. When .303 incendiary rounds struck these unprotected tanks, the results were predictable and horrific. Fuel began leaking immediately. Ignition followed within seconds. The SM.79 would bloom into flames, the fire spreading rapidly through the wooden wing structure. Crews had mere seconds to bail out before the aircraft became an inferno. This vulnerability contrasted sharply with contemporary British bomber design. By 1940, all RAF bombers featured self-sealing fuel tanks as standard equipment. The technology used layered rubber compounds that swelled on contact with fuel. When punctured, the rubber sealed around the hole, preventing massive fuel loss and dramatically reducing fire risk. The weight penalty was substantial, approximately 500 kilograms per aircraft, but the improvement in crew survival rates justified the cost. Italian designers had made a conscious decision to forego such protection. The SM.79's impressive range and speed came directly from minimizing weight. Every kilogram saved went into additional fuel capacity or improved performance. But this decision assumed that Italian bombers would face limited opposition, that defensive armament would deter attackers, that speed would provide protection. Against Hurricane 8's guns, None of these assumptions held. The first SM-79, shot down by a hurricane over Malta, fell on June 22nd. The bomber, conducting reconnaissance, was intercepted over Sliema and Valletta by Flight Lieutenant Burges. The hurricane attacked from superior altitude, raking the SM-79 with machine gun fire. The port engine was shot off. The bomber caught fire and crashed into the sea off Calafrana. Of the 6 crew, 2 survived. The pilot, Tenente Francesco Solimene, and 1 gunner were pulled from the water. 4 died. This engagement established the pattern that would repeat throughout the summer. SM-79 formations approaching Malta would be intercepted by hurricanes climbing to altitude. The British fighters would attack aggressively, closing to effective range before firing. The Italian bombers, lacking the speed to escape and unable to maneuver effectively in formation, would take terrible punishment. Those that survived the initial pass would break formation, attempting individual escape. Many would not make it home. By early August, Italian bomber commanders recognized they faced a serious problem. Daylight raids over Malta had become prohibitively expensive. The few hurricanes available were inflicting disproportionate casualties. Something had to change, but Italian doctrine and equipment both constrained options. The SM-79 could not be made faster without complete redesign. Additional armor would reduce performance below acceptable levels. Defensive armament was already as heavy as the airframe could support. The only solution was to abandon daylight operations entirely. By late August 1940, Italian bombers shifted to night raids over Malta. Under cover of darkness, they could avoid the hurricanes that had made daylight operations suicidal. The shift represented a complete admission that Italian bombers could not survive against modern British fighters in daylight. This tactical defeat came not from a single catastrophic engagement, but from the cumulative weight of dozens of raids where SM-79 seconds were systematically destroyed. The mathematics were brutal and inexorable. Each hurricane could destroy multiple bombers in a single engagement. The bombers could not defend themselves effectively. Speed advantage had evaporated. The vaunted Sparrowhawk had become easy prey for pilots who understood how to exploit every vulnerability. The hurricane's effectiveness over Malta in summer 1940 demonstrated several fundamental principles of air warfare that would shape the rest of the war. First, concentrated firepower mattered more than caliber. 8.303 guns, firing simultaneously, delivered more killing power than fewer, larger weapons. Second, protection was not optional. Aircraft without self-sealing tanks and armor could not survive modern combat. Third, speed alone provided no defense against faster interceptors with superior armament. These lessons would be relearned by every air force in every theater. But for Italian bomber crews flying SM-79 seconds over Malta in 1940, the lessons came at terrible cost. Hundreds of aviators died in flaming aircraft that their designers had assured them were invulnerable. The survivors returned to base with horrifying accounts of how quickly their bombers disintegrated under hurricane fire. What made the situation particularly frustrating for Italian forces was that the SM-79 was, by any objective measure, an excellent aircraft. It held world speed records. It had proven effective in Spain. Its range was extraordinary. The torpedo bomber variant would later achieve remarkable success against Allied shipping. The problem was not the aircraft itself, but the specific tactical situation over Malta and the mismatch between SM-79 capabilities and hurricane firepower. Italian fighter escorts provided limited help. The Macchi C-200 Saetta fighters that accompanied many bomber raids were fast and maneuverable, but their armament consisted of only 2 12.7mm machine guns. In combat with hurricanes, the Macchis could hold their own in turning fights, but they lacked the concentrated firepower to quickly destroy British fighters. More importantly, escort fighters could not protect bombers from determined hurricane attacks. The British fighters would simply accept combat with the escorts, trusting that some hurricanes would get through to savage the bomber. Formations. By September 1940, the pattern was firmly established. Italian bombers no longer attempted major daylight raids on Malta. The few that ventured over the island in daylight did so at extreme altitude, attempting to bomb from above the hurricane's effective interception ceiling. Accuracy suffered dramatically. Most bombs fell into the sea or struck empty ground. The raids became more harassment than genuine military operations. The respite would prove temporary. In December 1940, German forces arrived in Sicily. Fliegerkorps X, commanded by General-Lieutenant Hans Ferdinand Geisler, brought Junkers Ju-88 medium bombers and Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters to bear against Malta. The strategic situation changed immediately. German bombers were faster, better armed, and more heavily armoured than Italian SM.79 seconds. German fighters outperformed both the Hurricane and Italian escort fighters. But the 2 months from August through October 1940 represented a crucial period when Malta's defence hung on a handful of Hurricane fighters, destroying Italian bombers faster than Italian industry could replace them. The exchange rate favoured Britain overwhelmingly. For every Hurricane lost, and losses were remarkably low, multiple SM.79 seconds were destroyed. Italy could not sustain such attrition. The bomber force that had appeared so formidable in June had been reduced to night operations and cautious high-altitude raids by September. The human cost of this defeat extended beyond the immediate casualties. Italian bomber crews who survived engagements with hurricanes over Malta carried psychological scars that affected their combat effectiveness for years. They had been assured their aircraft was modern and capable. They had been told British defences were negligible. They had watched their comrades die in flaming aircraft, while defensive guns proved useless against attacking fighters approaching at 300 miles per hour. Morale collapsed across Italian bomber units operating against Malta. Crews began requesting transfers. Some aircraft developed mysterious mechanical problems before missions. The aggressive confidence that characterized early raids gave way to caution bordering on paralysis. When German units arrived and began suffering similar casualties to British defences, Italian aviators felt vindication. It was not their fault. The defences were simply too strong. But the truth was more nuanced. German bombers, with their armoured fuel tanks and heavier defensive armament, survived hurricane attacks more frequently than SM.79 seconds. German fighter escorts proved more effective at preventing British interceptors from reaching bomber formations. The fundamental vulnerability that doomed Italian daylight operations over Malta was the SM.79's unprotected fuel system, combined with inadequate speed to escape and insufficient defensive firepower to deter attacks. The 8 Browning machine guns of the Hurricane had proven more than adequate to destroy Italian bombers. The close grouping of the weapons created a concentrated pattern of fire that made deflection shooting more forgiving. The high rate of fire compensated for the relatively small caliber. The mixed ammunition belts with incendiary rounds turned unprotected fuel tanks into death sentences. British pilots developed specific tactics for engaging SM.79 formations. The preferred attack run came from above and behind, diving through the formation to build up speed, then pulling up through the bombers while firing. This approach minimized exposure to defensive fire while maximizing the Hurricane's speed advantage. Pilots aimed for the wing root area where fuel tanks were located. A good burst into that area would almost certainly start a fire. Alternative approaches included beam attacks from the side, targeting the fuselage and engines. Head-on attacks were discouraged because they exposed the Hurricane to concentrated fire from multiple SM.79 seconds simultaneously, and because closing speed made accurate shooting difficult. The standard 2-second burst delivered enough rounds to destroy or severely damage a bomber. Experienced pilots could destroy multiple aircraft in a single engagement by careful ammunition management and positioning. The Hurricane's stability as a gun platform contributed significantly to its effectiveness. The wide-track landing gear and relatively heavy airframe meant the aircraft absorbed recoil well and remained steady during firing. Pilots reported excellent visibility from the cockpit, making target acquisition easier. The Merlin engine provided reliable power throughout the engagement envelope. These qualities made the Hurricane particularly effective in the bomber-destroyer role, even though the Spitfire was faster and more glamorous. By late summer 1940, RAF pilots over Malta had developed confidence bordering on arrogance when facing SM.79 formations. They knew that Italian bombers were vulnerable. They understood how to exploit that vulnerability. They had seen enough SM.79 seconds explode in flames to believe correctly that they held overwhelming tactical advantage. This confidence translated directly into combat effectiveness. The Italian admission of defeat came not through any official announcement, but through the simple abandonment of daylight operations. By August, daylight raids had ceased. By September, even high-altitude daylight bombing had proven too costly. By October, Italian bombers operated over Malta exclusively at night, accepting the dramatic reduction in accuracy rather than face hurricane interception in daylight. This represented an extraordinary reversal of fortune. In June, Italian forces had believed Malta would fall quickly under sustained bombing. By August, they could no longer safely operate in daylight over the island. The handful of hurricanes based there had achieved air superiority through superior firepower and the fatal vulnerability of Italian bomber design. The contrast between Italian confidence in June and Italian defeat in August reveals how quickly battlefield reality can overturn peacetime assumptions. The SM.79 had excelled in Spain against obsolete Republican fighters. It had set world records for speed and range. It appeared to represent modern bomber design at its finest. But when confronted with a modern fighter mounting concentrated firepower, all its advantages evaporated. Speed meant nothing against a faster interceptor. Range was irrelevant if the bomber never reached its target. Records provided no protection against 8 Browning guns firing simultaneously. The deeper question was not whether the Hurricane could destroy the SM.79 that had been proven beyond doubt by late August, but why Italian designers had created such a vulnerable aircraft in the first place. The answer lay in the fundamental assumptions that shaped Italian aviation doctrine in the late 1930s. Italian military planners believed that future wars would be decided quickly through aggressive offensive action. They assumed that bomber formations operating at high speed could penetrate enemy airspace, deliver their weapons, and depart before effective opposition could be organized. They calculated that the weight penalty for armor and self-sealing tanks would reduce performance below acceptable thresholds. Most critically, they believed that Italy's potential enemies lacked the industrial capacity to produce modern fighters in meaningful numbers. Every assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The war did not end quickly. British industrial capacity, supplemented by Canadian and eventually American production, generated modern fighters by the thousands. Speed alone provided no protection once faster interceptors appeared. The weight penalty for protection proved far less costly than the casualty rates suffered by unprotected bombers. The SM.79's design reflected a specific moment in aviation history when bombers appeared to hold decisive advantages over fighters. Between approximately 1934 and 1938, bomber technology advanced faster than fighter development. Aircraft, like the SM.79, could outrun contemporary biplane fighters while carrying substantial bomb loads over impressive ranges. This temporary advantage convinced some air forces that the bomber would always get through, that defensive measures were unnecessary weight, that speed and altitude provided sufficient protection. The Hurricane shattered these illusions. The monoplane fighter with modern armament could catch any bomber and destroy it with concentrated fire. The .303 Browning, while not the most powerful aircraft weapon, delivered sufficient firepower when mounted in batteries of 8. The self-sealing fuel tank, while adding weight, provided protection that made the difference between aircraft returning damaged and aircraft exploding in flames. British doctrine had evolved differently. RAF planners recognized that bomber losses to fighter interception could be catastrophic. They invested heavily in both offensive and defensive technologies. Bombers received armor, self-sealing tanks, and increasingly heavy defensive armament. Fighters received concentrated firepower through multiple machine guns, later replaced by cannon. The weight penalties were accepted as necessary costs of survival. The contrast became stark over Malta in summer 1940. British Hurricanes, designed with protection and firepower prioritized over maximum speed, systematically destroyed Italian SM.79 seconds designed with speed prioritized over protection. The Hurricane pilots went home to fight again. The SM.79 crews died in burning aircraft or, if lucky, parachuted into captivity. The mathematics were brutal but simple. Survivability trumped speed when the speed advantage disappeared. If you find this story engaging, please take a a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Italian responses to the tactical disaster over Malta were constrained by industrial capacity and design limitations. Modifying existing SM.79 seconds to add self-sealing tanks would have required essentially rebuilding each aircraft. The weight penalty would have reduced range and speed below acceptable levels. Designing a replacement bomber would take years and consume resources that Italy simply did not possess. The only practical option was to shift tactics and accept reduced effectiveness. Night bombing avoided the Hurricane threat but sacrificed accuracy. Without visual reference to targets, Italian bombers relied on dead reckoning navigation and timed runs from identifiable coastal features. Bombs scattered across wide areas. Military targets went unscathed while civilian casualties mounted. The strategic objective of neutralizing Malta's military capability became impossible to achieve through night operations alone. German intervention in December 1940 temporarily restored Axis bombing capability over Malta. Luftwaffe bomber crews had learned harsh lessons over Britain during the summer. Their Junkers Ju-88 bombers featured self-sealing tanks, armor protection for crew positions, and heavy defensive armament. They could absorb damage that would destroy an SM.79 and continue flying. More importantly, German Bf 109 fighters could escort the bombers effectively, engaging British fighters on equal or superior terms. But the fundamental lesson remained. Unprotected bombers could not survive against modern fighters with concentrated firepower. The SM.79 represented the last generation of bomber design that assumed speed alone provided adequate defense. Every subsequent bomber design incorporated protection as a non-negotiable requirement. The casualties over Malta in summer 1940 proved that no amount of speed could compensate for vulnerability once intercepted. The specific tactical engagements that drove Italian bombers from Malta's skies were numerous and repetitive, rather than dramatically decisive. No single battle destroyed 23 SM.79 seconds. Instead, throughout July and August 1940, Italian bomber formations lost 1 or 2 or 3 aircraft per raid. Each Hurricane that intercepted could destroy multiple bombers. The cumulative effect was devastating. On July 10th, 20 SM.79 seconds raided Grand Harbour. Hurricanes intercepted and destroyed 1 bomber. On July 22nd, another SM.79 fell to British fighters. Throughout August, the pattern continued. Small losses on each raid accumulated into unsustainable attrition. Italian bomber strength in Sicily declined steadily. Replacement aircraft arrived but could not match loss rates. By September, the force was depleted to the point where major daylight operations became impossible. The human dimension of these statistics deserves emphasis. Each SM.79 carried a crew of 5 to 6 men. Each aircraft destroyed meant 5 or 6 Italian aviators killed, wounded, or captured. Over July and August, dozens of bombers fell over Malta and surrounding waters. Hundreds of Italian airmen died. Their families received official notifications. Their units conducted memorial services. The survivors carried knowledge that the next raid might be their last. Italian bomber crews were not cowards. They flew missions knowing the dangers. They pressed attacks despite heavy defensive fire. They maintained formation discipline even as aircraft around them exploded. But courage could not overcome the fundamental vulnerability of their aircraft. No amount of determination could make the SM.79 survive hits from 8 Browning guns. The bravery of Italian aviators made their losses more tragic, not less. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate casualties. Bomber crews who survived engagements over Malta returned to base, with accounts that terrified replacement crews. The speed with which SM.79 seconds caught fire became legendary. Veteran pilots described seeing aircraft ahead of them simply explode when hurricane fire struck fuel tanks. Survivors spoke of comrades who never made it out, trapped in burning aircraft that disintegrated before parachutes could deploy. This knowledge corroded morale more effectively than any British propaganda. Italian airmen understood that their aircraft were death traps against modern fighters. They knew that speed advantages were illusory. They recognized that defensive guns could not track attacking hurricanes diving at 300 miles per hour. Flying an SM.79 over Malta in daylight became synonymous with suicide. Units began experiencing higher rates of mechanical problems before missions. Sick calls increased. Transfer requests multiplied. Squadron commanders faced impossible situations. Orders demanded continued operations against Malta. Crews knew those operations meant high casualty rates. Aircraft were available but increasingly flown by inexperienced replacements, while veterans found reasons to avoid combat. The decay of combat effectiveness accelerated as the most skilled pilots died first, replaced by novices who lasted mere weeks before becoming casualties themselves. The comparison with German bomber operations over Malta highlighted Italian vulnerabilities. When Luftwaffe WWIIs raided the island in early 1941, they too suffered losses to hurricane interception, but German loss rates remained lower because their bombers could absorb more damage. Self-sealing tanks prevented catastrophic fires. Armor protected crew positions. Heavier defensive armament made attacking fighters more cautious. The WWII could take hits that would destroy an SM.79 and continue flying. German pilots also benefited from better training and more effective fighter escort. Luftwaffe doctrine emphasized close coordination between bombers and fighters. Bf 109 escorts stayed with bomber formations, engaging British interceptors before they could reach the bombers. When hurricanes did penetrate to the bomber stream, German gunners were better trained in deflection, shooting, and ammunition management. The cumulative effect was German bombers achieving mission objectives that Italian forces could no longer attempt. The Italian recognition that their bomber force could not operate effectively in daylight over defended targets represented a fundamental admission of technological and tactical inferiority. It meant that Italian air power could not support ground operations where air superiority was contested. It meant that strategic bombing of distant targets became impossible. It meant accepting a reduced role in the Mediterranean air campaign, allowing German forces to shoulder the primary burden. This had profound strategic implications. Italy had entered the war, believing its air force was modern and capable. The rapid defeat over Malta revealed how inadequate Italian aircraft and doctrine had become. German forces, arriving to support their faltering ally, found themselves carrying the main effort in the Mediterranean theatre. Italian bombers were relegated to secondary roles, night operations, and attacks on targets beyond British fighter range. The SM.79's later success as a torpedo bomber partially redeemed its reputation. Operating at low altitude against ships, the Spaviero proved highly effective. Torpedo attacks required different tactics than level bombing. Aircraft approached at wave-top height, making interception more difficult. The torpedo launch occurred at close range before fighters could engage. Speed and maneuverability at sea level gave the SM 79 advantages it lacked at bombing altitude. Between 1940 and 1943, Italian SM.79 torpedo bombers sank or damaged over 100 Allied ships, totaling more than 700,000 tons. These achievements included hits on major warships, the cruiser HMS Glasgow, the carriers HMS Indomitable and HMS Victorious, multiple destroyers, and numerous merchant vessels. The torpedo variant proved that the basic SM.79 airframe was sound when employed in roles suited to its capabilities. But these later successes could not erase the fundamental failure over Malta in summer 1940. The bomber variant, designed for high-altitude level bombing against strategic targets, proved unable to survive interception by modern fighters. The torpedo variant, operating in a completely different tactical environment, achieved results that the bomber could not. The contrast demonstrated that aircraft design must match mission requirements and expected opposition. The Hurricane's effectiveness over Malta established patterns that would repeat across every theatre. Concentrated firepower proved more valuable than fewer, larger weapons. 8.303 guns delivered more practical killing power than 4.50 caliber guns or two 20mm cannon. The volume of fire compensated for the relatively small caliber. The high rate of fire meant more hits in shorter engagement times. The multiple guns provided redundancy if individual weapons jammed. British doctrine eventually evolved toward heavier armament. Hurricane variants mounting 12.303 guns or 420mm Hispano cannon appeared in 1941. These provided even greater firepower against increasingly armoured targets, but the original 8-gun Hurricane remained devastatingly effective against unprotected bombers throughout its service life. Against SM.79 seconds over Malta, it proved more than adequate. The 8 Browning installation also provided tactical flexibility. Pilots could select which guns to fire, conserving ammunition or maximizing firepower as circumstances demanded. The wing-mounted position meant that gun jamming did not affect pilot visibility or aircraft control. Rearming and maintenance were straightforward, with ground crews able to service all 8 guns efficiently. These practical advantages made the Hurricane an excellent squadron aircraft, reliable and effective in sustained operations. The Hurricane's reputation has been somewhat overshadowed by the more glamorous Spitfire. The Spitfire was faster, climbed better, and had superior high-altitude performance. But the Hurricane was more numerous during critical periods, easier to maintain, more stable as a gun platform, and equally deadly against bombers. Over Malta in 1940, Hurricanes shouldered the primary burden of air defense. They succeeded in their mission, driving Italian bombers from daylight skies and preserving Malta as a British base. The strategic consequences of this tactical victory extended far beyond the immediate air battles. Malta survived as a British stronghold in the central Mediterranean. From its airfields and harbours, British forces interdicted Axis supply lines to North Africa throughout the war. Submarines sank supply ships, bombers struck ports, torpedo aircraft devastated convoys. The cumulative effect was that Axis forces in North Africa operated under constant supply constraints that contributed significantly to their eventual defeat. Had Malta fallen in 1940, the entire Mediterranean war would have evolved differently. Axis convoys could have operated without harassment. North African forces would have received adequate supplies. British positions in Egypt would have faced far greater threat. The fact that Malta held, and that British forces there maintained offensive capability, shaped the entire North African campaign. The Hurricane's defence of the island in summer 1940 was therefore strategically decisive, not merely tactically significant. The Italian bomber crews who died over Malta in 1940 were victims of doctrinal assumptions that proved false in combat. They flew obsolescent aircraft against modern opposition. They lacked the protection that might have saved their lives. They faced firepower that their designers had never imagined. Their courage deserved better aircraft and better doctrine than their nation provided. The lessons of Malta in 1940 were learned by all major air forces. Bombers required protection armour, self-sealing tanks, heavy defensive armament to survive in contested airspace. Fighters required concentrated firepower to quickly destroy enemy bombers. Speed alone provided no defense once faster interceptors appeared. These principles would be validated repeatedly across every theatre of the war. For the Hurricane, Malta represented vindication of its design philosophy. It was not the fastest fighter. It was not the most maneuverable. It did not have the highest service ceiling, but it was reliable, heavily armed, stable, and effective. Against Italian bombers over Malta in summer 1940, it proved decisively superior. The 8 Browning guns mounted in its wings wrote the obituary for the SM.79's daylight bombing campaign. The specific tactical engagements that drove this outcome deserve detailed examination. Each interception followed similar patterns, but differed in details that illuminate both Hurricane capabilities and SM.79 vulnerabilities. Consider a typical engagement from August 1940, an Italian formation of 12 SM.79 seconds approaches Malta from Sicily, flying at 18,000 feet. British radar detects them at approximately 50 miles distance. 4 Hurricanes scramble from Lucca airfield, climbing hard to intercept altitude. The Hurricane pilots use the radar information to position themselves upsun of the approaching bombers, gaining every possible advantage. At approximately 20 miles from Malta, the Hurricane formation spots the SM.79 seconds. The British fighters continue climbing, reaching 21,000 feet, 3,000 feet above the bombers. This altitude advantage is critical. It gives the Hurricanes potential energy they can convert to speed in a dive. It positions them where Italian gunners must shoot upward against the sky, making target acquisition difficult. The Hurricane leader signals the attack. All 4 fighters roll into steep dives, accelerating rapidly. By the time they reach the bomber formation, they are traveling over 350 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the SM.79 seconds. The speed differential is crucial. It means Italian gunners have minimal time to track and fire. It means the Hurricanes can choose their attack angle and break away before defensive fire becomes effective. The first Hurricane targets an SM.79 on the formation's left flank. The pilot aims for the wing route, where intelligence reports indicate fuel tanks are located. At 200 yards range, he opens fire. 8 Browning guns pour rounds into the bomber. The 2-second burst delivers 320 rounds. Perhaps 50 strike the target area. Several are incendiary rounds. The effect is immediate and catastrophic. Fuel begins streaming from punctured tanks. An incendiary round ignites the fuel vapor inside the tank. Flames blossom along the wing. The fire spreads rapidly through the wooden wing structure. The SM.79 pilot attempts to maintain control, but the burning wing begins to fail structurally. Within 20 seconds, the entire left wing is ablaze. The bomber rolls inverted and begins spinning toward the sea. No parachutes are seen. The crew dies in the burning aircraft. The second Hurricane attacks a bomber near the formation center. This pilot approaches from a slight angle, raking the fuselage from tail to nose. His burst hits the engines and cockpit area. One engine catches fire. The cockpit windscreen shatters. The pilot is wounded or killed. The SM.79 drops out of formation, beginning a long glide toward the sea. This crew is luckier 3 men, bail out before the aircraft crashes. They will be rescued by Italian air-sea rescue launches and returned to base, wounded but alive. The third Hurricane overshoots slightly, approaching too fast and passing through the formation without firing effectively. The pilot pulls up, bleeds off speed, and comes around for a second pass. By this time, the SM.79 formation has broken up. Individual bombers are turning for Sicily, jettisoning their bombs to gain speed. The Hurricane selects a straggler and pursues. At close range, nearly 50 yards, the pilot fires a long burst. The SM.79's tail section disintegrates under the impact of hundreds of rounds. The bomber goes into an uncontrollable dive and crashes. The fourth hurricane engages a bomber that is attempting to escape at low altitude. The Italian pilot has dove away from the formation, hoping to reach sea level where the hurricane's altitude advantage disappears. But the British fighter is faster, even in level flight. It closes it steadily. The hurricane pilot fires from dead astern, the least dangerous approach for him and the most dangerous for the bomber. The concentrated fire walks up the fuselage into the wings. Fuel tanks rupture, fire erupts. 79 crashes into the sea, leaving an oil slick and debris. The entire engagement lasts less than 5 minutes. 4 SM.79 seconds are destroyed. 3 Italian bomber crews are dead, 17 men killed. 1 crew partially survives, 3 men rescued from the sea, 3 killed in the crash. The 8 remaining SM.79 seconds flee to Sicily, many damaged, none having dropped bombs on target. The 4 hurricanes return to Lucca, all undamaged, ammunition expended but aircraft intact. This engagement was not exceptional, it was typical. Throughout July and August 1940, similar interceptions occurred whenever Italian bombers attempted daylight operations. The outcomes varied in details, but not in fundamentals. Hurricanes destroyed SM.79 seconds at exchange rates that made Italian operations unsustainable. By September, daylight raids ceased entirely. The Italian response to this tactical disaster was constrained by strategic reality. Italy lacked the industrial capacity to replace losses while simultaneously developing new aircraft. The SM.79 remained in production because no superior alternative existed in sufficient numbers. The SM.84, intended as a replacement, proved problematic and was produced only in limited quantities. The Kant Z-1007 was an excellent aircraft, but could not be manufactured fast enough to replace SM.79 losses. Italian fighter escorts provided minimal protection against hurricane attacks. The Macchi C-200 Saetta was a capable fighter, fast and maneuverable, but its armament of 2 12.7mm machine guns was inadequate against hurricanes. In turning fights, Italian fighters could hold their own, but they could not prevent determined hurricane attacks on bomber formations. British fighters would simply accept combat with the escorts, knowing that some hurricanes would penetrate to the bombers. Later in the war, better Italian fighters appeared. The Macchi C-202 Folgore, powered by a German Daimler-Benz engine, was fast and well-armed. The Fiat G-55 and Macchi C-205 featured even better performance and heavy cannon armament. But these arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the strategic situation. By the time Italy fielded fighters competitive with late-model Hurricanes and Spitfires, the war was essentially lost. The SM.79's vulnerability to hurricane fire became so well known that British pilots actively sought engagements with Italian bomber formations. They knew that each interception would likely result in multiple victories with minimal risk. This confidence manifested in aggressive tactics and sustained offensive operations. British fighters would pursue damaged SM.79 seconds far out to sea, ensuring their destruction rather than allowing them to limp home. Italian survivors of these engagements spread accounts throughout the Regia Aeronautica. The psychological impact was severe. Bomber crews understood they flew obsolescent aircraft against superior opposition. They knew their defensive armament was inadequate. They recognized that their fuel tanks were unprotected death traps. Flying missions under these conditions required courage that bordered on fatalism. Many bomber crews simply accepted that survival was a matter of chance, not skill. This psychological collapse manifested in multiple ways. Some pilots developed conservative flying habits, maintaining maximum altitude and avoiding any route that brought them within hurricane range. Others requested transfers to torpedo bomber units, where tactics differed and survival rates were higher. Still, others simply broke under the strain, suffering nervous exhaustion that removed them from combat status. The Regia Aeronautica's bomber force experienced sustained morale decay throughout 1940 and 1941. The contrast with later operations was stark. When SM.79 torpedo bombers attacked Allied convoys, they achieved impressive results and suffered acceptable casualties. The tactical environment favored the attackers. Low-altitude approach made interception difficult. Short engagement times minimized exposure to defensive fire. The torpedo launch occurred at close range where accuracy was high. These conditions allowed the SM.79's strengths, speed, range, robust construction to compensate for its weaknesses. But level bombing against defended targets exposed every vulnerability. High-altitude operations put SM.79 seconds in the optimal engagement envelope for hurricane interception. Long bomb runs gave defenders time to organize intercepts. Formation flying limited evasive capability. The combination was lethal. Italian bomber units learned through bitter experience that they could not survive in environments where the hurricane excelled. The hurricane itself underwent continuous improvement throughout the war. Later variants mounted 12.303 machine guns, dramatically increasing firepower. The Hurricane Mark II featured an upgraded Merlin XX engine, providing better high-altitude performance. The Hurricane Mark IC replaced machine guns with 4 20mm Hispano cannon, transforming it into a devastating ground attack aircraft. Each iteration improved capabilities while maintaining the rugged reliability that characterized the original design. But the basic Hurricane Mark I that defended Malta in summer 1940 needed no improvements to destroy SM.79 bombers. Its 8 Browning guns were entirely adequate for the mission. Its speed advantage was sufficient to catch Italian bombers. Its structural strength allowed aggressive maneuvering without risk of failure. The original design, conceived in the mid-1930s, proved effective against the best Italian bombers available in 1940. This spoke to the fundamental soundness of British fighter doctrine. The strategic lesson of Malta in 1940 extended far beyond the immediate tactical victories. It demonstrated that sea lane control required air superiority. It proved that small forces with superior equipment could defeat larger forces with obsolescent aircraft. It showed that protection and firepower mattered more than maximum performance. These principles would guide Allied air operations for the remainder of the war. Malta's survival as a British base directly enabled the eventual defeat of Axis forces in North Africa. The island served as an unsinkable aircraft carrier positioned exactly where it could interdict enemy supply lines. Every convoy sunk, every supply ship destroyed, every fuel tanker torpedoed contributed to the material starvation of German and Italian forces in Libya and Egypt. The hurricane's defense of Malta in summer 1940 made all subsequent interdiction operations possible. The human cost of these strategic outcomes bore most heavily on Italian bomber crews. Hundreds of aviators died in the summer of 1940. Most were young men, well-trained, motivated by patriotism and professional pride. They flew obsolescent aircraft because those were the aircraft their nation provided. They attacked defended targets because those were their orders. They died in burning SM.79 seconds because Italian designers had prioritized speed over protection. Their sacrifice achieved nothing. Malta remained British, Italian bomber forces were decimated, and the strategic situation only worsened. The survivors of the Malta campaign carried psychological scars for decades. They had witnessed the deaths of comrades in circumstances that made survival nearly random. They had flown aircraft they knew were death traps. They had continued operations even after the futility became obvious. The courage required to climb into an SM.79 and fly toward Malta, knowing that hurricane interception meant probable death, exceeded any reasonable standard of military duty. That Italian bomber crews continued flying. Such missions speaks to their professionalism and discipline. That their nation asked them to do so speaks to strategic desperation and doctrinal failure. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.